All right, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. My name is Terry. I am one of the leaders of the Des Moines area user group, and we have been going through this flow training process. And so welcome to all of you. We've got a fun flow to look at today. Clarissa will be our guide as we go through it, but let me go through a couple slides and then we'll get right into the flow. So just a reminder, if you can, please stay muted, and you're welcome to post questions in the chat. Clarissa, I'm okay if they want to unmute and ask questions as we go through, if you are.
Yeah, that's fine with me.
So if you have a question, feel free to unmute and jump in the middle of the process. So you can kind of ignore my guidelines there if you'd like, but do mute if you're not asking a question, just to help us with background noise. Reminder, we are recording. One thing too to keep in mind that these flows are not always intended to be practical things that you would implement in your org. They are designed more to help you learn. This one is actually, I think, one that you might find some decent use case to, but they are not fully vetted to be what I would call production ready. So they're again, it's mostly designed to help you learn as we go through. So keep that in mind as you look through the flow, or as we go through it. We have gone through several components of our training this year. This is the one where we are looking at Lightning components and Apex components. And we have added a 7th session that will be in November. And that is on the record triggered flows that I'll be leading. And that one's pretty exciting. I added it primarily because that is something that has come out recently during the year. And I think it's going to be a very, very important one for us to learn. And I'm going to walk you through how similar these record trigger flows are to Process Builder, so that as you start thinking about flows and you might be leaning toward, well, I know Process Builder, it's really easy, but Process Builder is also something Salesforce is now encouraging us to move away from and into flows. And record triggers is really has a kind of a low learning curve to get into them. And so looking forward to helping you learn record trigger flows in November. So our use case for today's training is we have an inside sales group needs the ability to quickly create multiple task records for a selected group of contacts. One or more contacts will be selected from the Contacts tab, and the screen flow then must display the selected contacts, allow the user to remove people from within the flow, and then allow users to define the various task fields. So they'll be able to basically complete or indicate, here's what I want to have as my subjects for those tasks that are going to be created from the Contacts tab. So that's our use case. The items that we'll be covering today are, how do we install Lightning components? There's a fantastic website, and I won't steal Clarissa's thunder on that, but you're going to love how easy some of this is. We will talk about assignments, decisions, Apex actions, screens, and loops. We will also be creating records, debugging our flow, and then obviously just running the flow and seeing it work. So with that, I am going to stop sharing. I'm going to let Clarissa take over and introduce herself and proceed with walking us through this flow.
Thanks, Terry. Hello, everyone. I am Clarissa Crittenden. I am the Salesforce lead for the HR instance at Corteva AgriSciences right now. I've been working in the Salesforce environment for about the last almost 8 years now. And I really enjoy flow. So I'm going to talk to you about it today. And following Terry's little agenda, obviously I have just the Contacts tab open right now. So what we want to do is create a flow that will let us basically use contacts from the Contacts tab and do stuff with them. So step 1, fun fact that I had to remind myself of the other day, if you're on the recently viewed list view, you actually can't do it. So, like I can't do any custom actions because I'm on recently viewed, and Salesforce just likes to sometimes be a pain for us like that. So we'll just switch to my contacts. And if you noticed over here, we had the create tasks button show up. So we're actually going to look at the flow that we've created that is going to let us create tasks for multiple contacts. All right, so this is our flow. Obviously, this is Flow Builder. We get here in the setup menu. Hopefully you know this because we're a ways into it. We're in training number 6 now, but we go to the setup menu, we go to flows, and then we can create a new flow. We can edit our flows. We can also, if we need to, look at various versions of flows by clicking over here. We can view details and versions. Helpful if you need to go back to a previously active version that is no longer active. So just a couple of reminders for you there. Okay, so we'll go into our flow now. Since this is a button we want to happen on the list view on the contacts tab, we actually start it by creating an assignment, and we're going to make sure that we have actually selected things. Always smart when you're building a Salesforce flow to put in kind of some fail safes to catch any user errors you might have, where if we're clicking buttons but we didn't actually select anything. So we have a variable that's going to hold the record count. We're just going to set that variable. This is a number variable, as we can see when we click on it. And it is going to equal count to IDs. So this IDs is very similar to if we are building a flow to trigger off of an individual record where Salesforce just tells us that it is ID. We're going to do the same thing where Salesforce automatically is passing that in there. And the trick with assignments, because sometimes this always trips us up, we always remember that the value we already know always goes on the right, and what we want, where we want to put that value always goes on the left. So this one always takes me a little while to remember how that works. So just bear that in mind. And if you forget, you'll always figure it out because you go to debug your flow and it will give you an error and you go, oh, right, I need to flip flop those. Okay, so that's going to be step 1. And then we're going to use what we assigned here to create our decision, because we want to make sure we're actually looking for IDs that have been selected. So if we don't find any, which would be that record variable, or that number variable, excuse me, that we just set is 0. Obviously, we have no records. And then we just need to set one condition because this is a decision element. Pro tip, always make these things that make sense to you. I think sometimes when we do decisions, we have a habit of just saying yes and no. The problem is that when we're debugging that, sometimes you know, we run into API name problems because we called everything yes, and then the second time we create a decision element, we also have another yes, and now we have to give it another one. So this is a good example because we're saying no records. We're being specific with it. If we did another record check later in this flow, we could, maybe we might change this to no records selected. And then we could add just a little more clarity with the label and the API name, but the API name is what's going to show up in our debugging. Also, I talk fast, so if I'm talking too fast, please let me know and I will slow down. Okay, so we have our no records, which goes to a screen, which is just going to say, hey, you didn't select any records, so you need to finish. Click the finish button to take you back. And we do have this IDs here, so this is good for us if we're checking this flow. This helps us know that it's correct. So if we're running this flow and we get the screen and it says nothing was selected, but then we also have information showing up below that, we know that something went wrong with our logic because we did actually have records selected. So it's always good to build yourself little fail safes that are going to help you, and sometimes your users, even if your users don't know what they mean. But hopefully it will help your users. Okay, so back to our decision, we're going to go to has records. So one of the things we're talking about today is Apex actions. So what this is, if we open it, this probably means nothing to us if we've never done one of these before. So if we look up here, the flow helper get contacts is actually the name of the Apex class that we're using here. So I'm going to scooch this over on my desktop just a hair. And, oh, this is one thing I forgot to open already. Okay, so we're gonna go over here and we're gonna look for classes, just so that you can see what it is. And we'll pull up Flow Helper Get Contacts. So we've all probably have at least seen this, even if we can't read code. This is the Apex class we're using. Sometimes Flow doesn't always get us the information we need. Maybe we need to get a lot of information, want to make sure we're bulkifying it correctly. We reach out to our favorite developer friend to help us write this. Also, if you're not a developer, that's okay. Other people are developers. And you can also Google things. So don't be afraid to use your friend Google to look up some of this stuff. And also be sure to post on the user group if you have problems. People are always really helpful there. So this is the code that we're using. Basically what this is doing, it is a class that we're calling Flow Helper Get Context. So we know that it is helping a flow. We're setting it as an invocable method, which just says we can call this from other places, like Flow, like Process Builder. And then we have also put a little description here too, so we know what it does when we are referencing it other places. We're setting, basically we're getting our list of contacts from that ID variable. That's what this is going to do. You don't need to be able to fully understand this. Just know that some of these variables we're gonna see happen in our flow too. Okay, so I'll go back to my flow builder. So if this were not already here, I would drag action over. And this would let us look for flow helper. So there it is. And then we would set our label, our API name. Because this is looking for the IDs that we already have, we're going to say we need to include something. And then we would put our IDs in here to pass into that Apex. So obviously I'm not going to save this because it is already in my flow, but I did just want to show you how to get that. It's not super intuitive because we have this icon, which is not the same as this icon. But anything that's gray and basically not a subflow is going to be this action. So you can do a lot of things with that. You can probably find Apex on places like Unofficial SF. Some of the actions that they have are Apex. Actually, probably a lot of them are Apex. So that is step one of our flow, essentially. Okay, so we found our contacts. The next thing we need to do is actually give our widget where we're going to create all these task records. So this is a screen flow. We're pretty familiar with probably a lot of the things on here, at least these top 4. So we have lookup to assign it to a user, I think. Assign to, well, we're looking at an account. It's fine. Oh, here we go. Current user ID. All right. And then we're going to add subject, due date, comments. Oh, but what is this? This is a lightning component that we have added to our screen. How cool. If we go down here, we can see, so anytime you install stuff, it's going to show up under custom. So we have the horizontal rule and we have a data table are showing up here. Sometimes what's happening over here doesn't make any sense to us if it's the first time we're using a lightning component. So both of these lightning components come from Unofficial SF, which I have pulled up over here. And if I actually, I'll just click on flow. So if we click on flow, there's a lot of good stuff on this website. Flow actions are going to be like the Apex that I just talked about. There's a lot of things you can do here. One of my personal favorites is, let me find it, navigate to record. That one is really helpful if you want to have a screen flow that runs that updates a record. You do have to use a screen flow to be able to use navigate to record, but you can have the flow run and then land them on either a refresh version of the record that that the flow updates, or like a child record if we're creating a child record with the flow. That one is really awesome. There's a whole lot on here though. So
and I did throw that URL into the chat window for you. So if you haven't noticed that that is out there.
And bonus tip. So this is actually, I think, was started by Alex Edelstein, who is now a Flow product manager for Salesforce. So he actually talks about a lot of these on the Flow release webinar. And so these are all free. They're not officially supported by Salesforce, but they're built by people at Salesforce. They're built by developers. They're built by Flownatics. They're really awesome. And you can use probably most of them in some fashion. And it's really great if you're not a developer because someone else has already done that work for you. So I'm going to go back. Oops, that's not the button I meant to click. We'll go to Flow Screen Components. Again, lots of stuff we can do here. So the two that we have are horizontal rule is one we put in, and this data table V2. When you are on Unofficial SF and you are looking at things you want to install, be sure that you're looking over here because some of these things are still listed here. Like you'll see these are listed as obsolete because they've compiled multiple things into one. I know there's actually a lot of stuff that they have now put into like a base components package. So you get a lot of these screen components in just one managed package or unmanaged package. I think they're unmanaged packages. So there's a lot on here. It's pretty cool. And we will actually just go into the horizontal rule one since I was looking at that one first. So we click on it on Unofficial SF. We can see screenshots of what it might look like. So this is actually a flow someone has built and they've put some horizontal, actually, no, this is not a flow someone has, but this looks like a record page. Well, how about that? Because it's a lightning component, so it doesn't necessarily have to be used in Flow. You could use it in other places. It all just depends on how it's been written. I will mention this about a lot of these. If you do know a little bit about Salesforce code, a lot of these you can actually update and just, they're open source. So you just install it in your org and then you can modify the code. I've done that before with, oh gosh, I can't even remember what it was, but it was something where I needed to use a custom object and it was only built for standard objects. So I updated the code to pull in my custom object. So this is what you'll get here. We'll walk you through everything you need to do. So like now we're seeing it here is what it looks like in a flow screen. This one clearly old because we're looking at old school flow builder here. But it kind of lets us know what each of these attributes are, what kinds of information we should put in them to make them work for how we need them to. And then if we need to install, we would click on installation. These are already installed though. So when I click on it, it's gonna come here. I already have it installed. I don't need to install it. Some of these installation buttons are gonna take you to what you're used to installing things from the App Exchange. Some of them are gonna take you to a link on GitHub. Either of those are fine. The GitHub ones, some of them will have a button on the GitHub page to install. That is kind of a weird process, but it will make sense if you go that route. And sometimes it will just be the code that you'll need to copy out of there and put into your org. So a couple of different ways that you'll see these for installation. Most of it is pretty intuitive, I think. So that's how we install things. That's where we find the documentation. So we'll go back into our flow builder. Okay, so we have this set as what we're gonna call this screen component. We're gonna call it line section break. We're gonna define a color. This is the HTML color value, which is gray. And then we're just gonna say auto for what our right margin size should be, which if we go over here and go back down, right margin size is saying the higher we make this, the shorter it will be, defaults to auto. So we just want it to leave it auto and that's fine. And then we have how thick we want it to be. We want it to be 1 pixel thick and we want a margin of 6 pixels. Okay, easy enough. Then we have our display text just saying this is what our data table is. So then we'll go to the data table. And this one is, I would say, substantially more complicated because what is all of this? That's a lot. And we also have input variables and output variables. So for this one, again, I actually used this component the other day. So this one, we're definitely gonna go over here. we will go look at data table V2. And we're going to scroll down. I did mention that a lot of this lives on GitHub. There's kind of a mishmash of where the documentation is. Generally, base documentation is available on Unofficial SF, and then you can get more documentation on GitHub. For the most part, I would say the input and output attributes are pretty much always listed on Unofficial SF. So especially the first few times you're using a component, you're going to want to have this pulled up so that you know what you need to be putting where.
I find that the second and third time I'm using a data table, because of all of them, I have to pull it up.
Oh, yes, yes. The ones for sure with a lot of attributes, I pretty much always just have this pulled up because there's so many and it's hard to remember what you need to do. Does it need to be an API name? How specific do we need to be? It can be a little insane. So we do give our data table an API name. We define an object. If I were adding this, I'll actually just add another one, just so you can see what happens. So you'll see when I first drag it over, I have to give it an API name, and just for the moment, so that I don't get an error, I'm going to call this data table v2. And then I have to define an API name. So like if I picked account, this is actually just a search, which is really handy. You don't actually have to put in the object. We're using the more modern flow tool of we're actually going to look for a specific object, which is really nice. So if you're using a custom object that maybe you renamed the label of and you don't remember what the API name is, you can look for it here. So if we did that, then we get the additional fields. So I did just want to mention that. I will delete this for the moment. Okay. So, all right. Now I have all of these fields, but what do they mean? So I can flip back over to Unofficial SF, and this tells me, okay, the ones I actually need to be sure I'm populating are my object, because we need to tell the component what object we're looking at, what fields we want to show up as columns, and it says those need to be a comma separated list of field API names. Okay. And then we also need to tell it whether we are looking at a collection variable of records, or if we are just passing in a collection of strings. So we have to have one or the other. Okay, so we'll go back here. Uh-oh, what just happened? Okay, sorry, my other computer fell asleep. It's all good. Okay, so the only columns that we want is name. So we're gonna say column fields, name. We just want one column, so we're just gonna put one thing in there. If we wanted another one, we would add a comma, and we would put another API name for our field here, but we just need the one. And then we are using a record collection. So we assigned this to our collection of contacts. If you'll remember, that actually came out of our Apex action over here, where we passed in IDs and we pulled out a collection variable of contacts. Okay. So go here. All right. So those were the ones we knew for sure we needed to have. All right. So then we go boop, 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 back over here. Okay, so now we know what the optional ones are. So if we had just passed in a string of what we wanted to show up in the table, we would have need to set the user defined object to true. We have some additional information where we can essentially pass in essentially like styling code from some CSS styling that will help it render the way we want it to be. There's a whole lot of options here. Clearly, we can add icons to columns if we want, if we're pulling in, maybe we're pulling in accounts, so we want the account icon. There's a lot of different things we can do here. We can set column widths, we can set cell attributes and style them with lightning styles. It's a little nuts. I would say for your first one, you're okay just sticking with the mandatory fields and then seeing how you feel about it. So we've just set this as we have a text field and we're labeling it contact because we only have the one column. So we just want to call it contact. So it's going to say contact at the top, and we're going to pull in the name of the contact. And that's pretty much all. Oh, configuration mode is letting people inline edit. So that's something that makes this data table component really popular. If you need people to be able to inline edit in a flow, you can do that by turning configuration mode on. If you needed them to multi-select things, which in this case we do because we want to remember we're creating tasks for multiple contacts. So I want people to multi-select contacts if needed, so we can either hide the checkbox column or show it. And this is kind of one of those Salesforce cases where you have to backwards think a little bit. If we want to hide the checkbox column, we would set this to true. We do not want to hide it, so we set it to false. And then we have to tell it what our key field is, which is ID. So there's a lot. I went through some of these. Let's see, if we wanted to do radio buttons instead of checkboxes, we could do that. We can not let things link out to the record. There's a lot of stuff we could do. And then, as always, we could set component visibility. We're not going to do that in this case because we want this to always show up because they're always going to need to select contacts. And then once they've selected their rows, we want to output that into the variable we're going to use to actually create our task records. So we're going to set that by checking the manually assigned variables. We're going to set that to output selected rows, and we're going to put another collection variable in here. This time very cleverly named selected contacts. So if depending on what our inputs were here, we would change where we're outputting data. So obviously the output edited, if we had enabled configuration mode, we might want to populate this one. If we were using that user defined option that I talked about earlier, we would populate these user defined variables instead. But we are using collection variables because we're making our lives easy and making Salesforce do the work for us. So awesome, we're done with this screen. So after the user checks their boxes, they say what tasks they want to create. Now we're going to loop through those selected contacts. And loops are also way easier than they used to be. I don't know if any of you have built loops in the past, but they used to be a lot more work than they are today. So today we just create our loop. We say what collection variable we're going to loop through. And we tell Salesforce whether we want to go first item to last item or last item to first item. Most of the time in something like this, doesn't really matter what direction you go in. Usually the only time I think that really matters is if we need to do something sequentially. I will tell you, I have never used last item to first item. I've only used first to last. So that's how we create our loop. Then our next item is going to be an assignment, and we're going to start assigning task values. So we are going to say we have a task record variable. I'm going to delete this so we can just see what that looks like. So this is a single record variable for a task. And then we pick our field. Remember I said earlier, we want the target field to be on the left and what we want to populate into that field on the right. So on our single object variable, which is the task, we're going to assign the task fields that the user populated on the screen for some of these, which would be things here like due date, text comments, was this from a screen component? So we can see where all of these are coming from based on pretty much where they are. The priority we're setting is normal. The user is not defining that. We're saying the values of status is not started. So we can tell just as we click around kind of what each of these things are. Excuse me. And then where we go into our loop specific stuff is with our what ID, which remember tasks are one of the weirdest objects in Salesforce because they have a related to field that can be pretty much anything, but it can't be a contact because a contact goes in the who ID. So our what ID is anything but a contact or a lead. So we're going to set that here, and then we're going to set it equal to loop contacts account ID. So I'm actually going to delete account ID so we can see. Okay, so this is what loops do now, which is great because it saves us work. It lets us know current item from the loop that we're currently in. If you had multiple loops, you might see this twice because it is going to give you the options for each loop, but we only have one loop and we're looping through contacts. So we're going to click it. And now I get all of my options. So say account ID. And again, we're using that same from the record we're currently on in our loop. We're going to set the contact ID to be the who ID. And again, we're getting our owner ID from the screen component. Okay, so we're going to click done. And because record collections are a little bit particular, we have to define our single record elements in one assignment. And in the second assignment, we're going to actually just add that the single object to our collection of tasks. So this one honestly always trips people up. I've done this a lot of times, but I still always want to put the single one on the left and say, add this to the one on the right, but it's always backwards. So collection on the left, single record on the right. All right. And then we're going to loop for each item. We're going to go through here to here. Then we're going to go back to the loop. When we're done with the loop, we're actually going to create our task records using that record collection of tasks. Pretty simple. And then we're going to give a success screen because it's always good to give our users in screen flows a success screen and a fault screen. We can make this as simple or complex as we want. So we're just going to say the tasks were successfully created. And if they're not successfully created, we're going to say something went wrong. It is okay to have fun with these depending on the culture of your organization. I know I like to make these fun and say like, uh-oh, something went wrong. And you know, I also usually in my fault screens will say like your Salesforce administrator has been notified. Otherwise, people will see this and then send you an email or a Slack or whatever and say, hey, this went wrong. And they tell you like 4 times and you're going, I know, I got the 47 emails because you tried to do it 47 times. So, you know, just remember that you want to make sure that this makes sense to your users. Your fault screens should make sense to your users and not necessarily to you as an administrator. Always make it make sense to your audience. Remembering your audience for a flow is very important. You want it to make sense to them. So we've built our flow. How exciting. And we could click debug over here. And what happens if we click debug? I'm going to click run. But no records were selected. I wonder how that could be. Is it perhaps because it wanted me to check a bunch of checkboxes and that didn't work? So if you were on this call earlier, you might have heard me and Terry discussing that sometimes while Salesforce has made a lot of great flow advancements, the debug screen does not always keep up with those advancements. So sometimes we would like to debug a flow, but the way that our flow is, we just can't use the debug option. So in this case, got my Zoom meeting pulled up, there we go. So in this case, I would actually know, okay, this is a button for a list view. So I'm just gonna go to a list view and try to run my flow. So I will pick these 2 people from the same account and I will say create tasks. And look at that. I'm pretending to be Terry right now, so it's going to assign all of these to me. I can say my subject is, I'm just going to be a really bad Salesforce user and just say call, and my Salesforce administrator will harass me about it later. I'm going to say I want to do this next week. Follow up on call on 10/13. And then I'm going to pick my contacts. So I'm going to pick next. Look at that, I successfully created tasks. Man, I'm really good at this. Click finish. Oh, well, that's maybe less than ideal behavior, but that's okay because we can also just click contacts and go back to the contacts tab. If we wanted to update that, we might actually use that navigate anywhere flow component. And then we could set it so that when they, well, I would probably do it so it actually happens after the success screen. We would do a navigate back to the contacts tab option. So that is this flow. Just to walk you through how you would actually set this up as a button, we would go to, first we would make sure our flow is active, which it is because of the deactivate. Actually, I'm not sure why the deactivate button is grayed out. But
You're on an earlier version.
Oh, well, that would do it, wouldn't it?
That's what I'm assuming.
Something, yeah. There's usually a reason for things like that. It isn't the active version though, so that's weird.
Oh, it is. Yeah, it is active in it.
Huh. Maybe because probably because it's using a button.
Yeah.
That's active. Well, the mysteries of Salesforce. I don't claim to know everything.
Oh, I wonder if that is true because of it being tied to that action. If
right.
It let us deactivate it.
We would probably have to create a new version and activate it.
Interesting.
So, okay. So my flow is active. So I'm going to go over here to my contacts tab and click edit object. I would go to buttons, links, and actions. I would click new. And this is actually a URL. So if I click on it. Okay, so this is a create tasks. So this would be a new button or link, and we're actually going to grab the URL for that specific flow. And because we want it to be on the list, we're going to say, let's let people do multi-record selection. We would, of course, remember that flow does have to be active for this to work. The next thing we would do would be sure that we actually have it in a search layout, which would be here. Probably in our default layout. Oh, maybe not. Now I'm going down the wrong path because this is the part that I don't often do list buttons. So it would.
And I don't know why this is, but it's in the search layout for the classic side is where it's at. And
that was my next guess.
View.
Yep.
That has confused the heck out of me multiple times as well. And then you see at the bottom there's your custom buttons that allows you to add it.
Okay, so that's how we would add it, and then it will show up. Remember, again, it will show up everywhere but on our recently viewed, because Salesforce likes to be a pain and not have custom things show up on recently viewed. So that is Lightning components and actions in Flow. Are there any questions?
Can you, Carissa, getting the IDs, can you kind of talk about that just a little bit more in detail?
Sure. So that's just kind of some Salesforce magic.
Right.
I will share my screen again and pull that up. I probably stopped sharing prematurely, but that's okay. So this is just, honestly, Salesforce Magic is the best way I can describe it in terms of whether you're pulling a collection or you're pulling one single record. ID is kind of the magic in this case. So we're just doing IDs. That is set up as.
You created a collection variable.
Yeah. That's all it is. It's a collection variable of text available for input.
Okay.
So that's all we did there.
It does have to be in lowercase, so you do have to spell it specifically like that. Otherwise, the magic will not happen.
But then in that assignment, you're assigning something to it, right?
So remember that my target is always on the left, right, and my populated thing is always on the right. So this is already populated because I passed this in when I checked my boxes on the contact list view.
Okay, so that's the Salesforce magic.
Yep. So this comes in populated.
Okay.
And then all we're doing is making sure that there is actually record. Well, in this instance, we're taking that collection and assigning a count value to it in our number IDs record count variable.
Okay, so then you can use it in your decision. Okay.
Yep, exactly.
It's very similar to the way that the record ID works when you're working with a single record. So Salesforce does something to pass in that ID, and as long as we are capturing it, then we can leverage it. So ID for collections, record ID for a single record.
Always lowercase.
Always lowercase, yes.
Okay.
So there's a lot of development like stuff in these particular flows where you're having to leverage components, and every one of them, as you saw when Carissa went through the screen, the horizontal line just had a few variables that we had to set, and you went into the data table, it had 1,000 of them. And every component, when you drag it on, that is going to be different, and it's based on however your developers have created that for you. So whatever they are exposing in code to allow you to adjust is what you're going to see then on that right hand column. And so while that data table, you might look at it and initially be a little bit intimidated by all those fields, I would encourage you to give it a try. That data table specifically is one that is very, very powerful and super, super helpful for you as you're doing flows. So try it out. This is a really simple use case for it. And I personally use the horizontal line all the time just because I like to be able to control the way it looks on the screen. It also lets me brand things a little bit more toward that org from a color perspective. So yeah, I think it just makes the screen's layout a little bit cleaner. So don't let the code aspect of it throw you off. That's what your developers are doing for you. So if you find that you cannot accomplish something that you want to do in Flow, and you've got access to a developer, just ask them to help you with that. See, and let them know that, hey, we need to create an invocable action, and they can extend Flow's capability pretty significantly, and help you accomplish a whole lot more than what you could do currently today without their help. So very, very powerful what we are able to do in flows, leveraging the support of our development team.
Carissa, can you go back to the contacts and then do the flow again? I just want to understand where the horizontal rule is coming in. I think I can understand where the names are coming in.
And we are getting an error that you see down there at the bottom of the page. I don't know for sure why we're getting that. I need to jump in and try to find out why we're getting that lightning out app error. But yeah, there's the line. You can see the line there, Kurt.
Yeah, but my question is, okay, so where it says contact and runner, that's the table, right?
Yes,
Okay.
This is the data table.
And then above that, where it says below is a list of blah, blah, blah. Is that the horizontal rule?
So this is our display text.
Okay.
So I'll actually just go over here and open this up so we can kind of do a...
Yeah, that'd be great.
Okay, so then we see the horizontal rule is between the comments and that display text. So the horizontal rule is just, where did that go? Right here. Horizontal rule is the HTML version. It just means line. So that's this black line that's running across. That's our horizontal rule.
Okay. And then can you go back to the flow builder?
Sure, you bet.
So then this part down here below is the list is just our display text. Okay.
Yep.
It's just another one you drug in. Okay.
Yep.
And then so you can display an image as well, like Terry was saying, if you wanted a logo or something like that.
Yes.
Yep, and you can tell which ones are custom and which ones are standard generally because of how they will display over here. So all these things that are custom, well, sorry, not custom, standard Salesforce ones have their little icons. Most of the time, the fields and the display text will actually display here. Your custom Lightning components are not going to show up the same way in the builder just because we have to essentially pass information into them. So you're kind of going to have a very different experience in the builder versus what the flow is actually going to look like to your end user. So when you're using these, it is important that you're debugging the flow or you're making it available just to yourself to look at if you can't quite make debug work for you.
And up at the top here on this you have the lookup component. So where does that kind of come in?
So that's actually looking at who our running user is, and it's assuming that I'm logged in as Terry, so I want to create these tasks for myself. But if I wanted to, I could assign them to someone else.
Ah, okay, so that's the lookup.
Yep.
And if you go back to the flow, I'm just trying to understand how all this.
Sure.
Okay, because lookup. So on the lookup. Okay, so current user ID. Okay, got that. All righty. Okay, so that's the lookup. And then up at the very top, it's just the name of this.
This is the name of our flow. Yep. And if we didn't want this to show up, we could always uncheck show header. And then it would not show up in our flow. If I were to save that, this would basically be gone.
What if you, what if you uncheck the footer? Maybe that takes away that.
So if you uncheck the footer, that's actually going to hide the buttons down here.
Oh, okay.
So we usually if you're hiding something, you're just hiding the header. And usually that's because we, like if we're putting it in a lightning modal, we probably want the lightning modal to display rather than the flow name. So
now I have seen people hide the footer and use their own custom footer for navigation. So
actually,
I think that is actually on.
I think there is one for buttons. I think there is
too, yeah.
Custom footer.
There you go, right there. And that's helpful if you're trying to brand your flow in a way that matches your, makes your marketing people happy.
And then if you go back to the builder again, sorry if I'm.
No, you're fine.
So then where does the next button come in there?
So the next button is going to be down here in the footer.
Control navigation. If you click into that
one.
There you go.
Next or finish. Okay.
Yep.
Okay.
And then you can add previous or pause if you want people. Usually you would want to do previous if you're doing a very complicated screen flow to let people move around. I don't find that people use pause very frequently. Most of the time we don't want to pause a flow. If you are going to let people pause flows, you do need to be sure you have a way for them to go back into their paused flows.
Yeah. Okay. So when it's paused, it just means the screen just sort of stays open unless they close it.
It's not necessarily, it's called a flow interview, is what the Salesforce term for it is. So basically you've started kind of this back-end process with your flow. If you were to click pause, Salesforce would save that kind of as a record, but you're not actually going to continue it. And then you would need to be able to go into your paused, I think they're called paused flow interviews. I can't remember. Yeah. So you would need to be able to go into your pause flows and then you would open it again and it would kind of resume where you left off. So wherever you have the flow displayed, it's not going to really show as paused there. You're going to have to pull up that list of paused flow interviews, which is why I think lots of times people don't use that. You'd have to have a very specific use case to justify pausing a flow, just because there's a lot of intricacies there. So most of the time, honestly, I don't know that I've ever made a flow pausable. It's a lot easier just to say you're going to do it all or you're not going to do it. Like it's 100% or 0%. So
I have used it before for very, very lengthy flow interviews, and you might be able to capture some of it, but then maybe you get partway through and it's like, oh crap, I don't have that information, so I need to stop, go find the information, and then come back and finish it later. But it's basically just taking a snapshot of where you left off. And that flow allows you to go do something else or whatever, and then you can come back and pick up where you left off. You have to be somewhat careful with versioning with that, because if you're in a flow that changes all the time or frequently, it can create some challenges I've seen with that. But
I think you'd also want to be really sure how you train your users and make sure you're training your users.
Is there any special permissions for these flows to get activated? Is it done by the administrator or the user?
Flows are always activated by the administrator, so whoever builds the flow would click on activate. But
Any special permissions for that?
On the user record, you do need to have them be marked as a flow user. And then, of course, they will need access to whatever objects are that you're navigating them through on the flow. So in this case, they need to be able to create tasks. They need to be able to see contacts, that sorts of things. Also with this one having that Apex class in there, because Apex is something that you do have to grant permission to, that in this example, you would definitely need to give them access to that Apex code.
Yeah, about the only time that would be different would be if we ran this as
yes,
system context.
System mode, yeah.
Mm-hmm. This is a relatively recent Salesforce change. If you do have, you know, a lot of permissions locked down, you could run it as system, and that would not use user permissions. But most of the time, I think you do want to have user permissions enforced. So if you are building an org that uses a lot of flows, it's just generally a best practice to, when you create a user, go ahead and mark them as a flow user so that they can run flows.
If we were to use that system setting so that it was running it as system, then what does that change as far as like the historical look at a record creation? It wouldn't show that the user initiated that, right? So that would be a problem.
It would be automated process. So anything that runs a system comes in as automated process rather than the user.
Okay. Yeah, that's good to know, because I know in certain situations we would need to have, you know, historical records of who was doing what. So
yeah. Yeah, so usually you're better off kind of figuring out, making sure your permissions will allow for it. Sometimes you can also do flows and subflows and have your subflow run as the other one, but you have to be really careful with that to make sure that where you're doing things will let it happen. They released this, I want to say, for the summer release, and they dove pretty deep in the flow release webinar about it, where they actually did a really great explanation on kind of use cases, what your difference is with sharing and without sharing. I would honestly, if you feel like you might need to go down this path because you don't want to enable permissions, I would encourage you to watch that webinar, because that, I thought, did a really good job of explaining what user versus system context means.
yeah, no, that's good. That's good information. Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
All right, good questions. Any other questions before we?
Yeah, a very short one. Where did you grab the URL that you added in the button for the flow?
Oh, yeah. So when you recreated the action?
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
If we go here.
I'm sure you must have already talked about it, but I missed it.
Oh, no, I didn't talk about it
no,
very
we
much.
didn't.
Okay.
So you're fine. It's because Terry built it and I just talked to it. So yeah, it's a Salesforce formula to grab the URL for flow. And this is pretty standard for flows. You do /flow / and then this is the API name of your flow.
Got it. Okay, cool.
And that will always use whatever the active version of the flow is. That's what it's going to pull.
And you'll see that URL portion, the portion that's inside the quotes. You can see that on your flow if you go back to your flow and then go back out.
The flow API name.
Yeah, go out of the flow to where you see your list of flows.
Got it.
Oh, yeah.
Kind of to that flow detail screen, whatever they call it.
Yeah. The flows page, and then it is, I think it's versions and details.
Yeah, the flows page, and right, and for some reason the flows page does not have any search or any search capacity, so you have to go to alphabetic wise to everything. I don't know why.
They are working on list view functionality. Actually, I think that's already. So you can create filters and list views on your flows now, which is super nice. But yes, we can, if we do view details and versions, we can actually get the URL, which we can drop into buttons. So you would do that for If you're doing a button like that, you can also, if I'm remembering right, you can add these as actions and pick flow, and it will just give you a list of your active flows.
Oh, right.
Yeah, that's what I was gonna ask. I've always just used the option where you pick flow as the action type. So is there a reason you'd go with a URL linking to the flow as opposed to just a flow action?
It's because this one is a list button.
Because
A
of
list.
the
Okay.
Yep. So because we want it to show on the list view and not on the like not on the detail page or anything like that. So if we were doing not a list view button, we would definitely have just created it as an action, picked a flow, and then grabbed our active flow.
So I'm going to go ahead and take over since we are at the bottom of the hour here. Great questions, Clarissa. Thank you. You did a fantastic job as always. She is what I consider, and I told her this before in the meeting, she's what I would call one of our expert flow people that's in the middle, at least in our user group here in Des Moines. So post your flow questions out in our community, and I've seen her respond to some of those before, but we'll do our best to try to answer questions as they come up with flow. I did want to let you know, though, that our next user group meeting is coming up at the end of the month. This is our larger quarterly group meeting. I'm really excited to, hopefully you see my screen. Steve Mollis will be presenting on formulas, and he's got an excellent presentation on that. If you have ever posted a question out on Salesforce's answers page on the community site, odds are you've seen responses from Steve. He is probably, he's not the top leader on there anymore. He used to be forever, but some other people have taken over. He's now number 3 at answering people's questions. But Steve is incredibly funny guy, and very sharp. He will be presenting for us for about an hour on formulas. And so hope that you will get signed up for that session. And then we do have our sponsor. They are giving out some nice gifts as well for us. So do sign up, and we'll hopefully see you at the end of the month for that. So thank you again very much for joining. If you have questions, please reach out to us on the community. We're always happy to assist. Have a great afternoon.